There's a moment, brief, almost easy to miss, when everything still looks intact. The cameras are flashing. The red carpet stretches endlessly beneath polished shoes. A young actor, confident but not yet hardened, stands in front of a global audience that believes it knows him. He smiles, jokes, shifts his weight with a restless kind of energy that reads as charm. At that point, nothing appears broken. But in hindsight, that moment feels less like a peak, and more like the edge of something quietly unraveling. This is the story of how Shia LaBeouf rose faster than most, burned brighter than expected, and slowly became one of the most complicated figures in modern Hollywood. Not through a single mistake, but through a pattern. A pattern that, over time, became impossible to ignore. Shia LaBeouf was born on June 11, 1986, in Los Angeles, California. His upbringing was anything but stable. His father, Jeffrey LaBeouf, was a Vietnam War veteran who struggled with substance abuse and worked sporadically as a clown and rodeo performer. His mother, Shia LaBeouf, was a dancer and visual artist, trying to maintain some sense of structure in a household that often leaned toward chaos. By LaBeouf's own accounts in later interviews, his childhood was marked by instability, financial strain, emotional unpredictability, and exposure to addiction at a young age. He has spoken openly about witnessing his father's heroin use, describing it not as a distant trauma but as something immediate and formative. There wasn't a traditional path laid out for him, so he built one. At around the age of 10, LaBeouf began performing stand-up comedy, not out of passion at first, but necessity. He saw it as a way to earn money, to contribute, to create some control in a life that often lacked it. He would later describe booking his own gigs by cold calling clubs and pretending to have a manager. It worked. That early hustle, equal parts survival and ambition, caught attention. Soon, he found representation. Then auditions. Then small television roles. By the early 2000s, LaBeouf had landed the role that would define his introduction to mainstream audiences. Louis Stevens in Disney Channel's Even Stevens. The show was a success. But more importantly, LaBeouf stood out. His performance wasn't polished in the traditional Disney sense. It was sharper, more erratic, more grounded in something that felt real. He wasn't just playing a quirky kid, he embodied a kind of unpredictable energy that made him compelling. In 2003, he won a Daytime Emmy Award for his role. He was 16 years old. For most young actors, this would have cemented a path. Stay within the Disney system, maintain a clean image, transition carefully into adult roles. LaBeouf didn't follow that script. After Even Stevens, he began pushing outward, into films that carried more weight, more risk. Holes in 2003 offered a stepping stone. It wasn't a massive blockbuster, but it showed he could carry a film beyond the confines of children's television. Then came the real turning point. By the mid-2000s, LaBeouf was entering a phase that few former child actors successfully navigate: reinvention. In 2007, he starred in Disturbia, a modestly budgeted thriller that performed well at the box office. That same year, he appeared in Surf's Up, lending his voice to a different kind of character, showing versatility. But it was what came next that changed everything. Transformers. Directed by Michael Bay and produced by Steven Spielberg, the 2007 film was designed to be a spectacle. Massive in scale, global in reach. LaBeouf, cast as Sam Witwicky, was at the center of it. The film was a commercial success on a scale that redefined his career. Suddenly, LaBeouf wasn't just a promising young actor. He was a global lead. The kind studios build franchises around. The kind audiences recognize instantly. The kind of momentum that's difficult to control once it starts. What made LaBeouf different, even at this stage, was the tension between his public persona and the roles he was being asked to play. On screen, he often portrayed the everyman, the relatable, slightly awkward protagonist caught in extraordinary circumstances. Off-screen, there were already hints that he wasn't entirely comfortable within that mold. Interviews from that period reveal a young actor who seemed both aware of and resistant to the machinery around him. He spoke candidly, sometimes too candidly, about the industry, about his ambitions, about wanting to be taken seriously beyond blockbuster roles. This wasn't unusual, but the way he expressed it carried a certain volatility. There were moments where humor edged into discomfort, where honesty felt less like openness and more like pressure leaking through. Still, the success continued. In 2008, LaBeouf starred in Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, acting alongside Harrison Ford in one of cinema's most established franchises. It was, by any industry standard, confirmation. He had made it. From a financially unstable childhood to sharing the screen with icons. From stand-up comedy in small clubs to global premieres. By his early 20s, LaBeouf had achieved what many actors spend entire careers chasing. But success, especially at that scale and at that age, rarely comes without cost. Behind the scenes, there were already signs that the pressure was building. In 2008, LaBeouf was involved in a car accident in Los Angeles. He was arrested on suspicion of DUI, though charges were later dropped due to lack of evidence. Still, the incident resulted in a hand injury that required surgery and impacted his work on Transformers: Revenge of the Fallen. It was one of the first widely publicized moments where his off-screen life intersected with his professional responsibilities in a way that raised questions. Not conclusions, but questions. At the time, it didn't significantly damage his career. If anything, it was treated as a minor setback, something a young actor could recover from easily. And he did. The Transformers sequel was released in 2009 and performed even more strongly at the box office. From the outside, the trajectory remained intact. But internally, something was shifting. LaBeouf began expressing dissatisfaction with the roles he was taking. He spoke openly about feeling disconnected from the material, about wanting to pursue more meaningful work, about the limitations of blockbuster filmmaking. Again, none of this was unusual in isolation. But combined with his increasingly erratic public behavior, it began to form a pattern. A pattern that wasn't yet fully visible, but was starting to take shape. There's a particular kind of pressure that comes with early success. Not just the expectation to maintain it, but to evolve it. To prove that the success wasn't accidental. To redefine yourself before the industry does it for you. For LaBeouf, that pressure seemed to manifest as a constant tension between two identities. The studio-backed star, and the artist searching for something more authentic. At times, he tried to bridge the gap. He took roles in films like Wall Street, Money Never Sleeps and Eagle Eye, balancing commercial appeal with more grounded narratives. But the friction remained. And as his career progressed, that friction didn't resolve. It intensified. By the early 2010s, LaBeouf stood at a crossroads. He had the resume. He had the recognition. He had the access to nearly any project he wanted. But there was also a growing sense, subtle but persistent, that something beneath the surface wasn't stable. Not yet visible enough to define him, but enough to suggest that the trajectory he was on wasn't going to continue unchanged. The industry hadn't turned on him. Audiences hadn't rejected him. He hadn't made a single catastrophic mistake. But the foundation was beginning to show cracks. And in the years that followed, those cracks wouldn't stay hidden. They would widen. Publicly. Gradually. And then all at once. There isn't a single moment you can point to and say, that's when everything broke. Instead, what happened to Shia LaBeouf unfolded the way pressure often does. Gradually, then suddenly. By the early 2010s, he was still working consistently. Still visible. Still on paper a bankable name. But the tone surrounding him had started to change. Not dramatically at first. Just enough to be noticed. The shift became more apparent after Transformers: Dark of the Moon in 2011. LaBeouf had already begun distancing himself from the franchise publicly. In interviews, he spoke candidly about his dissatisfaction with the later films, suggesting they lacked the creative depth he was searching for. He also made comments about director Michael Bay that hinted at tension, not outright conflict, but a clear desire to separate himself from the blockbuster identity that had defined him. In Hollywood, that kind of honesty can be a double-edged sword. On one hand, it signals ambition, an actor wanting to grow. On the other, it can be interpreted as disloyalty, especially toward projects that made that growth possible. Studios notice that. Directors notice that. And over time, it shapes how an actor is perceived behind the scenes. At the same time, LaBeouf began pursuing smaller, more experimental films. Projects like Lawless, 2012, and The Company You Keep, 2012, positioned him alongside respected actors and directors. These were deliberate choices, an attempt to recalibrate his career towards something more grounded, more serious. And for a while, it seemed like it might work. But off-screen, The instability that had only been hinted at before was becoming harder to ignore. In 2013, LaBeouf became involved in one of the more unusual controversies of his career, one that blurred the line between artistic expression and public misstep. He released a short film titled HowardCantor.com, which was later revealed to contain material closely resembling a comic by artist Daniel Clowes. The similarities were significant enough that accusations of plagiarism surfaced quickly. LaBeouf initially responded with an apology. But then, unexpectedly, he began posting a series of statements on social media that appeared performative. Some were copied from other sources. Others read like abstract commentary on art, authorship, and identity. At one point, he tweeted phrases that seemed to replicate apologies from public figures unrelated to his situation. It created confusion. Was this an attempt at satire? A form of performance art? Or a deflection? The answer wasn't clear. What was clear is that the incident didn't resolve cleanly. Instead, it deepened the perception that LaBeouf's public behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. Then came 2014. This was the year where the pattern became undeniable. In February, LaBeouf attended the Berlin International Film Festival for the premiere of Nymphomaniac, a film directed by Lars von Trier, a filmmaker known for pushing boundaries both thematically and publicly. LaBeouf arrived on the red carpet wearing a paper bag over his head. Written on it, in black marker, were the words, "I am not famous anymore." It wasn't a one-off gesture. He kept the bag on during the press conference. He removed it briefly to answer questions, then put it back on. The image circulated globally within hours. For some, it was interpreted as a critique of celebrity culture. For others, it felt like a publicity stunt. For many, it was simply confusing. Regardless of interpretation, it reinforced a growing narrative that LaBeouf was no longer operating within the expected boundaries of a mainstream actor. Months later, in June 2014, another incident shifted the conversation from unusual behavior to legal trouble. LaBeouf was arrested in New York City after a disturbance at a Broadway performance of Cabaret. According to reports, he was disruptive during the show, yelling, smoking, and behaving erratically. When security intervened, the situation escalated, leading to his arrest on charges including disorderly conduct and criminal trespass. During the arrest, statements attributed to LaBeouf were widely reported, including aggressive remarks directed at officers. He later pleaded guilty to disorderly conduct and was sentenced to treatment, including anger management and alcohol counseling. This wasn't abstract anymore. This was concrete. A public incident. A legal record. A moment that directly impacted how he was viewed, not just by audiences, but by the industry itself. Around this time, LaBeouf also began engaging in a series of performance art projects in collaboration with artists Nastya Sade-Ronco and Luke Turner. One of the most notable was titled #IamSorry. In it, LaBeouf sat silently in a gallery space, again wearing the paper bag over his head, inviting members of the public to interact with him one-on-one. Participants reported a range of experiences, some emotional, some confrontational. LaBeouf later stated that during the performance, he had been subjected to behavior that crossed personal boundaries. The project received attention, but it also further blurred the line between personal struggle and public display. Was this therapy? Art? A breakdown? The ambiguity became part of the narrative. Behind these public moments, LaBeouf has spoken openly, years later, about struggles with addiction. In interviews, he described periods of heavy alcohol use, linking it to both personal trauma and the pressures of his career. He has also referenced experiences with post-traumatic stress, particularly in relation to his upbringing and certain film roles that required intense emotional immersion. These disclosures add context. But at the time, much of this wasn't fully understood by the public. What was visible were the incidents, the arrests, the interviews, the increasingly unpredictable behavior. And in Hollywood, perception often moves faster than understanding. There were also professional consequences beginning to take shape. In 2015, LaBeouf starred in Man Down, a film that later became widely discussed not for its content, but for its box office performance in the UK, reportedly selling only a handful of tickets during its opening weekend. While the circumstances around that release were complex, the narrative that formed around it was simple. LaBeouf was no longer a reliable draw. At the same time, he had exited or been replaced in certain projects. Some departures were mutual. Others were less clearly defined. But the pattern was consistent. His position in the industry was becoming less stable. Then came one of the most serious developments. In December 2020, singer and actor FKA Twigs filed a lawsuit against LaBeouf, alleging abuse during their relationship. The lawsuit included claims of emotional distress, assault, and other serious allegations. LaBeouf responded publicly, stating that many of the allegations were not true, but also acknowledging that he had been abusive toward himself and others, and expressing a need for help. This marked a significant turning point. Unlike previous controversies, this wasn't about public behavior or artistic expression. It was about personal conduct in a private relationship, brought into the public and legal sphere. The response from the industry was immediate. Projects were paused. Representation shifted. Conversations changed. The narrative surrounding LaBeouf was no longer just about unpredictability. It was about accountability. It's important to understand that by this point, the idea of a single defining incident had been replaced by something more cumulative. Each event, on its own, might have been navigable, but together, they formed a pattern that was difficult to separate from his professional identity. Studios don't just assess talent, they assess risk. And LaBeouf, increasingly, was being seen through that lens. But there's another layer to this. Because while the public narrative was focusing on controversy, there were also moments, quiet, less amplified, where LaBeouf was doing work that suggested something else. Something more reflective, more self-aware. In 2019, he wrote and starred in Honey Boy, a film based on his own childhood and relationship with his father. In it, LaBeouf played a version of his father, a role that required him to confront parts of his past in a direct and unfiltered way. The film was critically well received. Many saw it as a breakthrough, not just artistically, but personally. Evidence that beneath the chaos, there was still a serious actor. A storyteller. Someone capable of translating personal pain into something meaningful. This duality became central to how LaBeouf was perceived. On one side, the incidents, the arrests, the allegations. On the other, the performances, the vulnerability, the attempts at understanding himself. The media often leaned toward the former. The work pointed toward the latter. And somewhere between those two realities, his career began to fracture. Not all at once, but enough that the trajectory he once had was no longer guaranteed. By the end of this period, the question wasn't whether LaBeouf had talent. That had never been in doubt. The question was whether the industry, and the public, were still willing to separate that talent from everything surrounding it. And increasingly, the answer was uncertain. By the time the narrative around Shia LaBeouf reached its most critical point, the shift was already complete. He was no longer being discussed as a rising talent, or even as a controversial figure navigating fame. He had become something else in the public imagination. A risk. And in Hollywood, risk changes everything. The consequences weren't always announced directly. There was no single press release declaring a fall. Instead, it showed up in quieter ways. Projects that moved forward without him. Casting decisions that went in a different direction. Conversations that stopped happening. One of the most visible examples came in 2020, when LaBeouf was initially attached to a major film project but was later replaced. Director Olivia Wilde publicly stated that the decision was made to maintain a safe and supportive working environment. LaBeouf later disputed aspects of that account, sharing communications that suggested a more complex timeline. But by then, the details mattered less than the perception. The industry had begun to distance itself. Around the same time, the lawsuit filed by FKA Twigs continued to shape the conversation. It wasn't just the legal implications, it was the cultural context surrounding it. Hollywood, in the wake of broader industry reckonings, had become more sensitive to issues of conduct, accountability, and workplace safety. In that environment, LaBeouf's situation wasn't isolated. It was part of a larger shift. Studios, producers, and collaborators were no longer evaluating him solely on his ability to perform. They were evaluating the potential consequences of working with him. And increasingly, those consequences outweighed the benefits. Yet even as opportunities narrowed, LaBeouf didn't disappear entirely. Instead, his career entered a different phase. Less visible, more uncertain, but not entirely inactive. In 2019, Honey Boy had already shown what he was capable of when he turned inward. Written during a court-ordered rehabilitation program, the film functioned as both narrative and confession. LaBeouf's portrayal of his own father was restrained, uncomfortable, and deeply personal. It wasn't a commercial blockbuster, but it was respected. And for a moment, it suggested a path forward. Not through spectacle, but through honesty. That trajectory continued, in a different form, with The Peanut Butter Falcon, 2019, where LaBeouf delivered a performance that many critics described as grounded and sincere. The film itself was modest in scale, but it resonated with audiences. It reminded people of something that had been easy to forget amid the controversies. He could still connect. On screen, at least, the volatility gave way to something quieter. Something controlled. Then, in 2022, LaBeouf appeared in Padre Pio, portraying the Italian priest known for his spiritual significance and complex legacy. The role marked another shift, not just professionally but personally. In interviews surrounding the film, LaBeouf spoke about a period of reflection that included time spent in rehabilitation and exposure to religious faith. He discussed finding structure, discipline, and a different sense of identity outside of the industry expectations that had defined much of his life. He also acknowledged past behavior more directly. Not defensively, not dismissively, but with a level of clarity that hadn't always been present before. This didn't resolve everything. It didn't erase the past, but it added dimension. Because the question surrounding LaBeouf was no longer just, what happened? It had become, what happens now? There's a tendency, especially in public narratives, to frame careers in binary terms. Success or failure, rise or fall, redemption or collapse. But LaBeouf's story resists that kind of simplification. Because even at his lowest public points, the work never completely disappeared. And even at his highest professional peaks, the instability was already there, running underneath. Part of what complicates the idea that he ruined his career is the fact that the industry itself hasn't entirely closed the door. It has narrowed. It has become more cautious. But it hasn't vanished. Independent projects, smaller productions, and certain directors still express interest in working with actors who bring intensity, even if that intensity comes with complications. The difference is scale and trust, two things that take years to build and far less time to lose. LaBeouf's own perspective, as shared in various interviews, suggests an awareness of that reality. He has spoken about hitting a point where the consequences of his actions became unavoidable, about recognizing patterns in his behavior, about the need to step away, not as a strategy, but as a necessity. These are not statements of resolution. They're acknowledgments. And there's a difference. At the same time, the legal and personal issues that contributed to his reputation remain part of the story. They don't disappear because of a strong performance. They don't fade because of a reflective interview. They exist alongside any attempt at rebuilding. And for many, they define the boundaries of what redemption can look like, if it exists at all. So where does that leave him? Somewhere in between. Not fully exiled. Not fully restored. Operating in a space that is less defined by momentum and more by uncertainty. There's also a broader context to consider. Hollywood has a long history of complicated figures. Actors whose personal lives conflicted with their professional success. In some cases, the industry made space for them. In others, it didn't. What determines that outcome is rarely just talent. It's timing, cultural climate, public sentiment, and the individual's willingness or ability to change. LaBeouf's story intersects with all of those factors. His early success gave him access. His behavior strained that access. His later work suggested introspection. But the environment around him had shifted in ways that made forgiveness less automatic, more conditional. And that's where the narrative becomes less about a single person and more about a system. An industry that builds stars quickly, that amplifies personality as much as performance, that rewards intensity until it becomes difficult to manage, then steps back. So, did Shia LaBeouf ruin his career? The answer depends on how you define ruin. If it means losing the trajectory he once had, the blockbuster leads, the studio-backed franchises, the unquestioned upward momentum, then yes, that version of his career is gone. But if it means the complete end of his ability to work, to create, to act, that's less certain. Because the talent that brought him into the spotlight hasn't disappeared. What's changed is the context in which that talent exists. The conditions. The expectations. The margin for error. In many ways, LaBeouf's career hasn't ended. It's been redefined. Not by a single failure, but by a series of choices, circumstances, and consequences that reshape how he is seen and where he fits. There's a final image to consider. Not from a film. Not from a red carpet. But from those quieter moments in recent interviews, where LaBeouf speaks without performance. Measured. Aware. Sometimes uncertain. It's a different kind of presence. Less about proving something. More about understanding what's already happened. And maybe that's where this story actually lands. Not at the peak. Not at the fall. But in the space after both. Where the narrative isn't finished, but it's no longer in control of its own direction. Where the question isn't whether he can return to what he was, but whether he can become something else entirely, and whether the world watching is willing to see it.